Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Globalization and Empire, our topic for today. And with us we have Professor Manfred Steger from the Department of Political Science at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. He's also Honorary Professor of Global Studies at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT. So thank you very much, Manfred, for coming over and share your views with us.
Thanks for having me, Ibrahim.
Our pleasure. And let's start with first, your interests and what made you go into this globalization in terms of your research and teaching.
Well, I think it's a very good question because I started out in the field of political and social theory as a theorist of ideas. So my early work was really around the question of how did in Europe social democratic societies become social democratic, in other words, moving out of a kind of a liberal framework into what then became socialism or social democracy. So my background is really in European social thought. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of questions around the issue of social change. How do societies change? What directions does change take? And most importantly, are we moving, hopefully, from a situation that may be problematic, that may have flaws, that may have shortcomings, into a society that is more just, that is more equal, where distribution is more equal, and where the people truly have more of a democratic participation in society. So social change was really at the very core of my interests. And it's therefore no surprise that when in the late 1990s, we all witnessed after the fall of the Soviet Empire and the stretching of the American empire, and the beginning of what many people called a turbo-capitalism, a turbocharged capitalism, people all of a sudden were talking about globalization. That concept really exploded in the 1990s. And I was attracted to it because out of my work on social democracy, I was connected to this idea of internationalism, cosmopolitanism, and all of a sudden here was this new word called globalization. And I said to myself, well, let's take a look at that. What is it? And ever since I then started to think about it, get involved in debates about it, I got more and more interested and then began to write about globalization myself.
Oh, wonderful. And it's interesting when you say social theory. I mean, we ought to remember social theory doesn't come from someone lying on the beach,
That's right.
and thinking about things, but really observing material conditions, and abstracting that particular theory from there. So it is not an idle kind of thinking.
Oh, no, not at all.
That really defines and determines quite a bit of things that we do, what we call maybe now globalization, transnationalism, what have you. So it's...
That's very important in my work. I'm glad you mentioned that because there is very importantly for me, a very strong connection between theory and practice. So when people hear theory, very often they think exactly as you put it, this kind of abstract, disconnected realm of contemplation for its own sake, which some people may want to do, that's fine, but I'm not interested in that type of theory. I'm interested in the kind of theory where you get ideas in action.
Yes.
Where you get the connection between the material world and the ideal world. And I think in many ways, it's not a question of which one is first or which one is more important, but I think the material world and the world of ideas really connect together.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm interested also when you talked about, that you are immersed in social theory in Europe, okay?
Yes.
But we have to remember that most of the main theorists and political economists, etc., were European. I mean, we have some American, but they don't really compare, with those Europeans, Germans, French, what have you. Yeah, so it's important to, talk about that particular thing and its relationship to, the question
That's
of
right, and I'm European. I was born and raised in Vienna.
Yeah.
So, for me, that was my cultural context. but I wrote about globalization, and I hope that my own life is kind of an example of that, because I got my education in the United States. I got my first jobs in the United States, in Illinois, in Washington State, then moved to Australia for almost 10 years, and worked in Melbourne at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and then came back to Hawaii, and that's where I teach now.
That's where you got your master's, I think. From.
Yes, I got my master's about 25 years ago.
Oh, wow. And you have altogether about 25 books, right?
Just about.
That you have written.
Yes, some of these books are edited, some of them are co-authored, but it's just.
But the bulk of them, like 17, are like your work, and maybe a few of them co-authored.
That's right.
And the rest edited. But the edited books are also very important because, they deal with those things that you have just introduced
That's right.
us to in this program.
That's right.
That's wonderful. And I wanted to talk also about the question of globalization and globalism, because what we have talked about before, like social theory or theory in general, which is an abstraction from social reality and things happening on the ground, that is the question of then what is the relationship between globalism and globalization in terms of theory and practice, or theory and movement.
Well, I think that's a very important distinction for me, because globalization, the way I define it, has something to do with connectivity. And the fact that social relations have become expanded, they have become faster, and they stretch across world time and world space. So globalization is really a process that happens in the world out there, but it's also a process that happens in people's consciousness. In other words, awareness of the fact that the world is becoming a single place is part of that material process of globalization. Whereas globalism, like all isms, is an ideology. And what I mean by an ideology is a kind of a set of ideas and values and norms that various groups and classes in society accept as truth or orient themselves toward. So, for example, every political ideology has a certain kind of agenda. We know liberalism, we know conservatism, we know socialism. There are all kinds of concepts and ideas that people hold dear, that they associate with, and that's an ideology. Now, what is globalism? Globalism is the ideology, or one ideology of globalization, that holds that globalization is not only very important, the core concept of our time, but there are certain values and norms and ideas that they associate with globalization. So, for example, those people who I call market globalists or market globalism think that globalization is about the liberalization and integration of global markets, and they think that's a good thing. So there's always this normative, this kind of value judgment on markets being good and the expansion of markets being good, and that's what market globalism is about.
And always good.
Always good. Under any circumstances, it's a good thing. And so, but that's not the only globalism. I think there are also other globalisms that kind of confront or contest that idea that globalization is all about this integration and expansion of free market capitalism. So, for example, there are people, and I've written about them, who I call justice globalism, or justice globalists, and those people feel that globalization is as important, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't be globalists, but they think that globalization is not just, or shouldn't be just about the expansion of markets. As a matter of fact, markets are fine, but they ought to be regulated. Markets ought to be, in other words, not allowed to simply run roughshod over the common good, over the public, but they need to be regulated. By whom? Well, this is where globalization comes in. By new forms of governance, what's called global governance, new institutions, maybe institutions like the UN, except that they become, I think, more globalized in the sense that they create a governance structure that would allow for a, quote, more just, a more equitable distribution. That's why I call them justice globalism, because at the core of the idea of globalization is the notion of justice, especially distributive justice.
So those two globalisms, you know, and we can, within those, maybe like there are subsets of that. Those two globalisms have to do, it seems to me, I mean, as reading, you know, in between the lines, you know, the subtext, they seem to me that they have to do with which side of the stick you're holding of globalization, the short end or the long end of the stick.
Yes.
So here we are then looking at the relationship between ideology and also the question of class, which is central in much of your writing, especially the recent ones.
Yes, I think another way you can look at that is to say that market globalism has a vision of imposing globalization from above.
Absolutely.
Meaning that economic elites and political elites work together to impose a certain form of globalization that has to do with deregulation of markets, liberalization of trade, privatization of enterprises, all of those things. Whereas I think the justice globalism would be globalization from below. In other words, a globalization of ordinary people, very often classes in society, like working class, you know, farmers, that are not necessarily, very often, marginalized by those in power. And they have a different kind of vision. They contest that vision. So you can see globalization from above, globalization from below.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much, you know, that I have to ask you. But let me start with the question of, you know, in terms of ideology, going back to the globalism as an ideology. You know, earlier we talked about theory, and that how theory is abstracted from social reality and has a lot to do with, you know, your interpretation of what's going on the ground. Hence, you know, if you go one step further, I'm not saying up or down, but one step further, then the question of ideology comes from that kind of observation, and it's like a quick fix kind of thing, you know, ideology about what you think is important, etc., under certain conditions. But if that ideology maintains in its ossification and, you know, not immutable, etc., then, you know, it would be hitting walls without knowing that it is hitting walls, and therefore the persons or people who are who subscribe to it would have a cul-de-sac, you know, reach a dead end, and then they cannot go further than that. So what I'm trying to say here then, on the basis of what we mentioned, is that actually it's always important to continue to challenge your ideology and see if it really corresponds to social reality, and if not, maybe you can change it. And then ideology will become important to do. Instead of reinventing the wheel each time, it can guide you in a certain way. But if it continues to be ossified, it's gonna make you hit the wall.
I think you're making a very important point, and one of those points that I think also extends into this story of globalization that's very often told, which we know is the story that globalization is inevitable, globalization is irresistible, and globalization, of course, from the point of view of globalization from above, means that markets are inevitable, and this kind of marketization is irreversible. And in other words, those elites try to naturalize, depoliticize globalization, and give people an impression that globalization is like weather, like a hurricane.
You know, it's a force, it's a natural
law, and there you cannot do anything about it. And you have two choices: either you can get on that train, on that juggernaut, or you're going to be run over.
Yeah. On this matter, I mean, you wrote a book. I think was it 2004 or after?
2003.
2003, and we're gonna show it on the Elmo. And so, if you could, because that's what you know that the book deals with. So, if you could say something more about that particular book, because I think it's an important, at least primer for people who want to be introduced to this kind of globalization.
Yes, I think the subtitle says it all. It's called A Very Short Introduction. And what that means for me me is that I wrote this book for general audiences, ordinary people, students, people who might be even faculty who want to know more about globalization.
I was going to say some professors too.
Some professors too, but ideally for a very, very large and mass audience. And the purpose was to explain to people what I think globalization and this kind of globalization debate, this globalization buzz is all about. Mm-hmm. So what I do in the book is I talk a little bit about the fact that globalization has certain definitions that are contested. Mm-hmm. I talk about the fact that globalization has several dimensions. Globalization is not just about economics. Mm-hmm. Globalization is also about politics, it's about culture, mm-hmm. and about the environment. Mm-hmm. And most importantly, at least for me, it's also about ideology. In other words, it's about ideas of globalization mm-hmm. that's contested. Yeah. And then, I also at the end talk a little bit about what is the future of globalization? Where do we think, or where do I think, globalization is going? In other words, I'm trying to make the argument that globalization is not inevitable or somehow already predetermined. Yeah. But my argument is that globalization is kind of contingent. It can take on different types of forms, and people and the participation of people and the input of people can push globalization in certain kinds of directions.
Right. Yeah, so it's like man-made, it's not a natural order.
That's
natural
what
law.
It is.
I just want to, I'm looking at chapter 2, mm-hmm. which is globalization and history.
Right.
Is globalization a new phenomenon? I mean, this is, I think, is an important topic, mm-hmm. because that reminds me actually of the question of world system theory.
Yes.
And what I wanted to ask you, as you were talking like minutes ago, your notion of world systems theory and globalization, do they relate to each other? What might there be differences?
Yeah, I think that world systems theory relates to globalization. World systems theory is based on the idea that starting in the 16th century, mm-hmm. There was what we now would call a global economic system that was beginning to emerge. Yeah. And that was, of course, capitalism and industrialization. That's Wallerstein. Yeah. And as it developed over the next few centuries, it became very clear that world system, that capitalist system, had a center, which mm-hmm. was basically, quote, the Western world, mm-hmm. particularly Europe and the United mm-hmm. States. Mm-hmm. It had a periphery, mm-hmm. which we called Third World, or sometimes called, I prefer Global South, or less developed, underdeveloped countries, mm-hmm. all that kind of language. Mm-hmm. And it had a semi-periphery. Mm-hmm. In other words, countries and regions that were in between and mm-hmm. were industrializing, mm-hmm. but weren't quite yet where the core states mm-hmm. were. So in other words, what I like about Wallerstein are two things. Number one, he takes very seriously the idea that capitalism is a very important driver in social development. Mm-hmm. We talked about change, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And secondly, is that he doesn't look anymore at particular countries. This is called methodological nationalism, meaning that as though we can deduce everything in world history by just looking at this little box called country, he looked at the world as a whole. Right. And I think that's where the connection to globalization comes in. Yeah. Globalization, at least the way I see it, is similar in taking the world as the basic unit of analysis, not the nation state. Yes. Yeah. But globalization, I think more than Wallerstein, is interested in not just a system and how the parts relate to each other, mm-hmm. but I think globalization theory is very much interested in connections, flows, links. Mm-hmm. So it's a dynamic kind of view of what type of society are we getting when we're looking at it through the global lens. And one of the key words, I think, in that, which I think is true, is a network society. Right. That the world is becoming not like it's a system where you can still see those parts very clearly, but it becomes more like a network that has many, many, many nodes and many, many, many connections that are constantly changing. Yeah, that reminds me of like Andre Gunder Frank, center, periphery, etc., which later on he says,
I don't believe in it anymore because he moved. But the other thing in terms of like the world system, like André Gunder Franks, he talks about it as 5,000 years and not like the 1500 or 16.
And this goes back to your question about, chapter 2 on history, how old is globalization? Well, you could basically make the argument that globalization is very, very old. But just like a car, you can drive a car in first, you can drive it in second, you can drive it in third, you can drive it in fourth and in fifth. In other words, there are shifts. And so globalization is a process that started thousands of years ago, but has accelerated at certain points in human history.
And the shifts are not quantitative, merely quantitative.
Not merely quantitative.
They are qualitative
as well.
I mean, that's where, I have some problems with world system theory, in terms of qualitative, especially Gunder Frank's system.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is very good. I want to say, just like mention a couple of chapters, the title, The Economic Dimension of Globalization, that's one, and then the political dimension of globalization, and that's the cultural dimension. So you have like a multifaceted, multidimensional notion of globalization, which you alluded to earlier in our discussion. And then the interesting one, chapter 8, I like global crises, well, not one, not more than one, and the future of globalization. So that's an interesting thing. It seems to me that here we might be talking about that instead of making the future of globalization always top-down, is that now because of resistance, etc., is like bottom-up, and it's for at least the overwhelming majority of the population, and justice, and real democracy, and all these kind of things. So I just wanted to say that, but also to connect it with another book you have written, Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as an ideology. And I remember an expression that you say, well, globalization is like old wines in new bottles, remember? And it seems to me that in terms of ideology, liberalism is old wine, but now it has the new bottle of neoliberalism. So as we show this book, the next one on neoliberalism, could you say something about that book and, what you think of what we just talked about?
Yeah, I think that in many ways you're right, that obviously these ideas, these capitalist ideas, if you take someone like Wallerstein, right, have been around for many hundreds of years. So it goes back really to the 16th, 17th century. So this idea that capitalism is good, that markets are good, and we need to primarily think of human beings as commercial beings, exchanging beings, as economic beings, is something that's pretty old. So and very often it's related to the term we use to talk about that theory, going back to someone like John Locke, is liberalism, right? Because the idea was that freedom, that liberty also has something to do with free markets and free economic activity, right? So that's the old liberalism. So what's new about liberalism is that liberalism, in many ways, those ideas about markets and those ideas about exchanges have gone global. So it's no longer the old liberalism of various nation states and what happens within that bubble called the nation state, but it's about the fact that liberalism has become global, and neoliberalism then is about a global program that endorses the idea, and these are my big three, of what? First, deregulation. Deregulation of what? Of private industry, of private firms. In other words, get the state off my back, business people are saying. Neoliberalism is saying that the deregulation of businesses is a good thing, that government should not interfere with free economic activity, let them do their own thing. The old notion of laissez-faire, let them do, is now becoming globalized. The second very important idea that relates to that is liberalization. Liberalization of what? Of trade. In other words, it used to be that trade activities were highly tariffed by various states, right? It's a tax on imports, right? And the idea of liberalization of trade is free trade, meaning no taxation, free flow of trade, which again is the idea that this is actually beneficial because people are going to be purchasing and consuming goods. They're going to be cheaper. There's no extra tax charged on them. So it really benefits the consumer, right? It's the idea of neoliberalism. And then thirdly, privatization. That's the third big concept. And that is that private hands are always better in managing money, managing the economy than what? The government, the state. So any kind of state-owned enterprises, such as railways or anything that the state holds, roads that supposedly are the common good, would be managed much better if we transferred that into public hands.
So you pay a toll when you're driving. You know?
Exactly, or prisons. Right?
Yeah, prisons
are going to be managed by private companies because they're more efficient. Is the argument. So those three big old ideas, have become newly matched to what? Globalization.
Globalization, yes, absolutely. But here we have a number of problems with that, and here where the ideology of neoliberalism, the people who hold it keep hitting a wall, and yet they insist that they want to make like a big hole in that wall and move forward.
Right.
What I'm referring to, look at the U.S. debt, for instance. From a couple of trillion, now we have 18 trillion, 18, 19 trillion. This is because of those kinds of the globalization that occurs. The other thing that is really problematical, and even though economists, mainstream economists see this, if you and I see it, they are doing the research, they must be seeing it, and yet they don't deal with that. The most of these people who might be critical would be like Stiglitz, for instance, or something like that. But it's still, within the realm of the question of liberalism, at least, and that is we had the crisis of 2008. And the good,
crisis.
the GFC. And the thing about it that it first started in the U.S., and then the U.S. moved it, exported it everywhere, etc. And then even now we are not yet out of it, completely. So, and yet people continue with the question of privatization and so forth. So, in fact, to me, neoliberalism is like an old ideology that doesn't work, that really is disastrous to the population, and now we're talking about global population. Another thing I would like you to, maybe comment on is the question of, is it really free trade? They talk free trade, but these NAFTA, for instance, North American Free Trade Agreement, as an example, or all these kinds of agreements, regional agreements, etc., for free trade, or World Trade Organization for that matter, and now the TPP. Is that really free trade, or is that regulation?
Well, I think that there are two different ways of looking at it, of course, right? One is that once you get rid of tariffs, there's freedom in a sense that there's no longer any tax that's being charged on the exchange of goods. So formally, it appears to be free.
Right.
However, what we very often forget is that the very products are being produced under conditions that are always seeking the cheapest labor market.
Yes.
And in that sense, the very condition of producing those goods and commodities that are being supposedly exchanged in a free way are produced under conditions of very often wage slavery.
Yes.
In other words, under conditions that many writers have talked about. Someone like Naomi Klein wrote a book called No Logo. We know the sweatshops. We know the conditions where sometimes people are locked in for many hours, can't even leave their factories, can't even leave their workplaces, are being paid a pittance, very little money. And So what we are talking about when we talk about trade is we have to talk about the whole picture of trade, not just the supposed flows that are now taxed, but what trade, of course, encompasses is also the production of commodities.
Absolutely,
and that has to be brought into the
and
discussion.
some of the workers were burned to death because the gates were closed. And all
I think the other thing that neoliberalism, you talked about neoliberalism and some of the downsides, and I agree with you. I think perhaps the biggest downside of neoliberalism that I can see is the question of inequality.
Absolutely.
And increasing inequality. There are now many, many studies out that show that the inequality within countries, as well as between countries, has really increased. So for example, in the United States, the top 1% of the population own 40% of the nation's wealth. I say this again, the top 1% own 40% of the wealth, which means that the bottom 20% own not even 10% of the wealth, and that disparity is getting larger. So a lot of neoliberals say, well, but hold on a second, Professor Steger here, don't be so quick, because isn't it also true that millions and millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in China and in India and in places like that? And the answer to that is, yes, there are a lot of people who, in terms of income statistics, they moved very often from rural areas where they didn't even get a salary to towns and so on. So yes, if you look at it in those terms, it's true. But if you look at it in terms of where is the benefit of globalization going, the answer is vastly disproportionately to the 1%.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so that's what you started out with, the question of inequality and the gap increasing. I mean, that is another problem with this kind of ideology. I mean, it's not working. And I want to remind us all, I mean, I know you know, and I know about the quote-unquote Arab Spring occurred because of these kinds of inequalities, etc., right?
Yes.
In large part because of those kinds of things. And we have all kinds of problems and resistance to globalization and globalism worldwide, because that's globalization from
and I think
above, from below.
I think the Arab uprisings also, in a way, people are saying, oh, well, this is dead now. The Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings are dead. And, what I say to that is you should watch zombie movies, because what happens is that very often what you think is dead is not dead. And why is it not dead? Because the very cause of why it came about in the first place, particularly, I mean, you know much more about this than I do, in a place like Egypt, had something to do with the disappearing middle class and the fact that poverty was on the rise.
Yes.
And the distribution of wealth and income was unequal. And I think those conditions have not changed, and therefore I wouldn't be surprised if sooner or later we're going to go right back to new uprisings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like mayhem in the Middle East right now. You wrote another book which is like a reader. So could you tell us about that, and in what way does it differ from those two?
Yes, it's called the Global Studies Reader, and it's different in a sense that it tries to make a case for if you want to call it that, a new field, a new transdisciplinary, a new interdisciplinary field called global studies. In other words, my argument is that globalization cuts across so many disciplines that in a way it would be really better to create this new field that I call global studies. That there are many programs now in the country. There are more than 300 universities that have programs in global studies. And what I did in that book is I basically introduce readers to a variety of perspectives on globalization, and from, as we just talked about, from the economic point of view, from the cultural point of view, from the social point of view, from the ideological point of view, so many environmental point of view, many different perspectives, and make a case that what we should be doing in higher education is we should really rethink our current, still existing, disciplinary walls. Yeah. And it's interesting because they go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, very Eurocentric view of the world, as though you can cut up knowledge into these watertight compartments called disciplines. And I, as you probably know, I'm a big proponent, a very big fan of rethinking that disciplinary structure and actually coming up with new ways of bringing together different kinds of fields under different knowledge umbrellas.
Yeah, I would also say not only a fan, but someone who has worked towards that, towards that goal. Example, these books, but also you're teaching, and you have led some kind of initiatives on campus here.
That's right.
And at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology.
Yes, we now have a global studies interdisciplinary major. So in other words, students can go to, we have a wonderful interdisciplinary studies program on campus, and they can go there and they can now major in global studies in that program, which we put together. We also created an introductory course to global studies that students can take, which fulfills part of their general education requirement.
Yeah, I think this one, this is the second edition.
This is the second edition.
2010 and 2015.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's interesting because, I mean, the question of like not compartmentalizing knowledge is very important.
I think it's very important.
Yeah. The other thing, in fact, you know, I wanted to ask about, as you were talking, I wanted to ask about, like, for instance, still you know, specifically, I would say economists, and some political scientists who are still going with this neoliberal, and maybe like they're trying to fix it here and there and everywhere. I mentioned like Stiglitz, for instance, as an example. But you know, the whole curriculum in terms of economics, I mean, it's not working. I mean, because of the, you know, things happening on the ground, like the gap between rich and poor, you know, inequality. People are stressed out even more, working more for less, and, you know, the rest.
Well, this goes back, I think, to what you said before, Ibrahim, which is that ideas always are connected to material practices and to people. And I think that as societies change, remember I was talking about social change being at the core of my interest, as societies change, ideas change and knowledges change. And if we truly, truly commit ourselves to democratic education, then education should reflect what the people going through. And what the people are going through economically is not necessarily what you learn in your typical economics department, right?
No, that's exactly. I mean, so we're doing a disservice to the student. I mean, they might be able to, like economists might be able to like forecast how much budget does the state need, you know what I'm saying, which is important. I mean, there's practical stuff. But in terms of the larger picture, like creating more, you know, housing and this and that and the other, all the like solutions, quote unquote, they're coming up with, I'm reading about, is like neoliberal kind of solutions.
Right.
Who in the first place, these are the ones responsible for our, you know. I mean, it's just amazing, you know, how they, like, you know, driven to the wall as though like that wall is very important. So it's a religious symbol or something.
I think though, I think on the upside though, I think we have to probably say, I would say, that here at the University of Hawaii in the College of Social Sciences, we really do a pretty good job in terms of interdisciplinarity. I mean, we have departments that have studies in the back, like ethnic studies, the department where you come from. And I think we also have a dean that is an economist, but has a kind of a much larger view in terms of fostering this kind of interdisciplinary thinking.
I mean, that's, we are a little bit
we're a little ahead of the curve here. I would say that.
That's true. But I mean, I'm talking in general.
Yes, in general.
Yeah, especially Europe, the United States. Europe may be a little bit better because they have more openness, etc. To the point that they can elect like left-wing governments, etc.
Exactly.
Like, you know, here it's like, whoa, what is that? Like Obama is like a Marxist, Leninist, or something, according to people.
Well, you get both in Europe, right? I mean, we just did elections in Greece where the left-wing party was renewed in power, but we also had elections in Switzerland where for the first time, in a post-World War II country, a radical right-wing party was elected the strongest party in a democracy.
Yeah, and that one is a neutral country. So
supposedly.
I wonder, if you have a right-wing government, how neutral can you be? So this is a contradiction of even the social structure and political structures of these kinds of things that we are, we're seeing as a function of globalization.
That's right.
Yeah. There's this. We want to talk about empire. We have kind of like in the back of our minds, we have the empire, or if we read between the subtext of what we have talking about, you can imagine empire in our discussion, etc. But the last book you wrote, the most recent was last year, is it
2013?
2013, yeah. So this is, so it's not the last book, but
right.
2013. Justice, Globalism. I mean, here we put the theory and the practice together.
Exactly.
So could you say something about that?
Yes. This is a book that I worked with, again, we talked about transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, with a colleague in Australia from sociology and another colleague in Holland who does a lot of religious and movements, social movement studies. And what we tried to look at was there is an organization called the World Social Forum, which was set up about 15 years ago, very consciously by progressive activists as a counter to what everybody knows, the World Economic Forum. We talked about Switzerland. They meet in Davos, Switzerland every year, and there's always a big deal about that because it's basically the globalization from above people meet in Switzerland, and the globalization from below people meet at that World Social Forum, usually in Brazil or in North Africa, in Tunis, or in Senegal, in Dakar. So in other words, in places in the Global South to provide the alternative view, the justice globalist view. So our research question was very simple. There are about 150 various organizations, civil societies organizations from all around the world that are connected to this World Social Forum. Our question was, do they have a coherent common ideology? Meaning a coherent common set of ideas and values that we could term justice globalism? Or are they kind of more single issue movements and they have different ideas and different values and they kind of come together
Very important,
just because of pragmatic reasons, because power is in strength, right? So that was the first question, is there coherent ideology? The second one is, do these organizations, if they have a coherent ideology, translate that equally coherently into concrete practice, policy kind of oriented types of things. So we looked at finance policy, particularly in the context of the global financial crisis of 2008. So do these groups connected to the World Social Forum kind of have common policies in the finance area? The second area we looked at was climate change. We are obviously in a huge crisis having to do with global climate change that, again, I think in many ways can be connected back to structures of global capitalism. And then the third big crisis, policy that we looked at was food and the food crisis. And we expected going into this study that, well, when it comes to ideas and values and norms, maybe there are really different orientations, and some people may come from a more traditional Marxist backgrounds, others may come from the environmental movement, others may come from feminist movements, and others may come from the Global South. They may have different kinds of views and ideas. So they may not be very coherent ideologically, but when it comes to actually practice, kind of working together, they probably pull together and they pragmatically have a more coherent kind of policy posture. That was what we expected. Now, what our work found out is exactly the opposite. That when it comes to ideas, to agendas, to programs, to values, those organizations connected to the World Social Forum really are very closely kind of connected around what we called core values, such as solidarity, such as justice, sustainability, diversity, those types of things. When it comes to policy, what we found is, unfortunately, they're actually not so coherent. And what we found is that they basically have three different kind of approaches. The first one is an approach that says we have to work within the existing system, which is global capitalism. And we can make a huge difference if we change the way capitalism works. How do we do that? Through regulation. So we re-regulate capitalism on a global level. That was the first kind of approach. The second kind of approach, which I would call obviously not reformist, because that's the first one, but transformationalist, was the notion that we have to transform capitalism. Capitalism is at the very core, and unless we transform capitalism and the political institutions that support it, that go along with it, we're not going to get anywhere. And then the third one, which is I think in many ways the most interesting one, was a position that we called de-link to relink, meaning that the posture was we shouldn't worry about global. First we should worry about local, but then out of our local concerns, connect to other local groups that have similar concerns, and thereby globalize our posture. So you could call that posture globalization. The local and the global really coming together, but with the emphasis that we first start with the local. So those were the three different kind of positions. And then there was a final thing that we discovered, which is groups also really disagreed on priority. So which policy should we focus on first? Some said climate is most important. Others said, no. Before we do that, we have to talk about financialization of capital and to talk about that. Others said, no, food is really the most important thing. And then other groups said, no, we have to start with children. So in terms of where we should start practically to put our efforts, our concerted efforts together, there was disagreement.
Yeah. So that raises a number of questions, like when you were talking about delinking, quickly, Samir Amin comes to mind, because he was like the question of delinking. But
Walden Bello
in
the Philippines.
Walden too. Yeah, but Amin way before.
Yes.
But the other thing is that this is a more sophisticated delinking notion from that Amin has.
Yes, it's not about localism in a sense that we want to retreat to our kind of local things. No. But it's really a posture where we say, let's start with linking various localities together into a global network. So globalization is very much on the mind of those people. But what they want to do is they want to start with local concerns and then link those local concerns to other local concerns in a kind of a global network.
Yeah, and by the way, Amin is changing his tune on this one, more into globalization and all of that, which is important.
It's very important.
Yeah, and he has written quite a bit about like Egypt and all of that, and globalization and empire and all of that thing. So that's one thing that I was looking at. The other thing is that in terms of, we talk about globalization and empire, and let's take the social forum, for instance. And by the way, there's some such thing called also U.S. Social Forum. Happened, I don't know when is the next one. One happened a few years
Those are
back.
regional, linked to the World Social Forum.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, we take, the question of the social forum. The problem is this, to me. There are like these forces that come into the forum and then they argue with one another or whatever. Hopefully they come up with something good. But the thing is that if these guys do not have concrete kind of social movements, not only like social movements that are loosely organized, etc., in their own particular countries, but really social movements that political movements, etc., that are really have a strategy, have something for change in that particular region or at least state. Because regardless of this question of globalization, we still have states, and states are still, qualitatively changed. qualitatively changed, but they are states and they are responsible for guardians as guardians of globalization in their own particular region, meaning like, connected, say, to the US, for instance. And if you are a globalization activist, I can hit you over the head and the US would support you, hitting you over the head. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so political structures to do those kinds of changes, in the local is very important. And here, like, the global is local and the local is global.
That's very important.
We are sitting down somewhere.
It's global. I think in many ways globalization is a better word than globalization.
Yeah.
But I think you're expressing, one of two views that's I guess the conflicting views at the World Social Forum. The first view, and it's still the dominant view, is that because the World Social Forum was created as an open forum of exchange of ideas, that it should not be in the business of creating political structures. It should just be a forum where people come together, exchange ideas, and that's it.
I agree with that.
And then the other view, which also many now on the World Social Forum express, is that's not enough. What we need to do is we can't just be a forum where we debate those things, but we actually should be a site where we create new institutions. So, for example, one of the concrete ideas was, how about if the World Social Forum might be a foundation for the creation of a world party, a political party. And I think that those two views now are almost equally strong, and in a way, the World Social Forum sooner or later will have to make up its mind which way it's going to go.
Yeah, no, I said I agree with that because the question of change has to be in the local picture.
Yes.
And that's why. And then later on, if the local picture is strong enough, etc., you can come to, shall we say, for the lack of a better word, an international.
Exactly.
Whatever, fourth, fifth, international, whatever. So this would come later because you have to build up. And exchange of ideas is very good. I mean, so that I wanted to say. The other thing, I just want to show people like some of the links that are interesting on your webpage. One I see here, Heaven on Earth, The Rise and Fall of Socialism, interview with Professor Steger. So I think, could you say something about that?
Yeah, that was actually a PBS television series about the rise and fall of socialism from the 19th century to the supposedly end of the Soviet Union as kind of like the end of socialism. And I think it was produced by people who had more of a mainstream view that socialism was something that was born in the 19th century, died in the 20th century, and that was about it. And I think they brought me on the program because they needed to be more balanced and get a view that would not agree with that. And I don't agree with that. My part in that series was to some extent contest the idea that socialism is simply something that can be born and die. Because what's really at the core of socialism is the idea of cooperation and the idea of justice and the idea of equality. And I think those three ideas, no matter what you call the system that defends those ideas, you can call it socialism, you can call it justice, globalism, whatever, that will always, I think, as long as they're human beings, will guide human beings' action. So the idea that in a way we can say that, well, with the death of socialism, those kinds of ideals are out the window, I think that's a very poor
And some people even go further and say communism.
Yes, of course, there's the question of what is the link between socialism and communism, then we get to Marxism, and then we get to the Soviet Union. And it's not that simple.
So, but two other questions. I mean, there's a lot of links that are important. Another one, if you could talk a little bit about it, the RMIT Globalism Research Center, because you are like involved with that. I mean, you want to say something about it?
That's a research center within the university, RMIT University in Melbourne. And what this research center does is it's bringing together, again, across the disciplines, right? So you can see that transdisciplinarity is really, really big in globalization studies. Brings people together to work together, to collaborate on specific research projects. So, for example, again, most of these projects have to do with social change. So some people might very concretely look at the question of social change in East Timor, for example. Question of security, question of state formation, to what extent is East Timor as this kind of newly established state coming out of Indonesia in 1999, to what extent is the situation in East Timor one that we can classify as a failed state? Is it a failed state? What does failed state mean? So there's a whole research project around East Timor and people who work on that. Another example would be a research project around the idea of migration and migration flows, and what does this mean with regard to citizenship? Can we still have this old idea that to be a citizen means to be affiliated, give you a loyalty to one particular nation state? Well, under conditions of globalization, we have more dual citizens, people who are more fluid. So in that sense, there's a research project around that.
Well, we still have like 5 minutes, but what I want to say is this, that we should do another session like this, because there's a lot of questions that
we need to talk more about empire.
We need to do that because one of the things I'm thinking about is the question absolutely the question of empire, but also like when we talk about globalization, global processes, etc., and like global institutions, World Trade Organization and so forth. And yet, I mentioned that earlier, yet we have the state. I mean, many states. And there are police states, there are democratic states, there are this state, the other state. There's monarchies, absolute monarchies, what have you. Okay, so then the question is, what's the relationship at this particular juncture between state and, globalization? That's one thing that could be talked about more.
Absolutely.
But then I'd like to hear, what you think about that, like in a minute or so.
If I can just summarize it very quickly. I think that nation states are not going out of business. I think that nation states are very important players in the globalization game, but they have to reinvent themselves to fit the conditions of globalization. In other words, it used to be that nation states thought that they were the only game in town and could control to some extent, even though the control was never perfect, a certain kind of territory. It's called sovereignty. And I think increasingly what nation states are finding is that they have to restructure themselves, they have to reinvent themselves in ways where they become part of a game that's no longer played in these little mosaics, but on the large global stage.
The other thing also related to that, I mean, the question of states and transnationalism.
Yes.
States and globalization and transnationalism. What's the difference between that? This requires a lot more discussion. But I mean, just a quick thing about that. What do you think?
I think transnationalism still has at its core the idea of the nation. So you're saying trans, meaning across, right? So you go across nations. But I think if you think of it in terms of what's the basic unit of your analysis, it's still nation. Whereas global does away with that idea of privileging the nation. And what does global privilege? It privileges new formations of space, right? And new formations of time in terms of dynamism.
Good. But here then, this transnational class that some people say it is forming now, is supportive of globalization. So you see, so you're moving...
A certain form of globalization.
Yeah, of course. I mean, globalization from above.
We always have to say that.
Yeah. I mean, the dominant one at this point. So I think these kinds of things, why I kept them till the end, because important to do like another, program on that to really discuss those kinds of things and see what kind of writings have...
and I'll just very quickly, I think, also the question of can we, when we talk about empire, can we just simply reduce it to American empire? Or do we have to think of empire, not in these old imperialist views, but is empire actually something that's not necessarily just reducible to the United States?
Right, no. Because if you're talking about transnational classes and transnational organizations and this and that, then you cannot talk about empire in the old way, like Ottoman Empire, British Empire, French Empire, and the rest of these kinds of empires. So imperial in a qualitatively different way in a context of globalization. Those kinds of practices that they had, all those empires, and later on the U.S. empire, right, when the Soviet Union was still going on, led to whatever we are experiencing now. Therefore, the imperial, kind of context is now different, and in this particular question of globalization becomes important. Well, thank you very much. We're flat out of time.
Thank you.
And mahalo nui loa, and see you next month. Aloha.